It was one of those shimmering July afternoons when the sky stretched out in a flawless blue sheet, the kind that made every child dream of cotton candy and roller coasters. The Westvale Amusement Park pulsed with laughter and music, its faded pastel paint still managing to charm the crowds that gathered there each summer. Amid the buzzing energy, two 7-year-old boys darted through the crowd. Nathan and Noah Branson were mirror images of each other, from their tousled blonde hair to their mismatched sneakers. Ellen Branson watched from a nearby bench, sipping iced tea from a waxy cup, her eyes never straying far from the Ferris Wheel where her boys had just joined the line. The ride, an old behemoth of rusting steel and creaking bolts, had been a fixture in the park for decades. Locals called it the spinner, and despite its age it still drew long lines and longer stares. The twins were next in line, their hands gripping the railing, jumping in place with excitement. Ellen glanced down for a moment, distracted by her buzzing phone. When she looked up again, the twins were gone. The operator assured her they had boarded. He remembered their matching red T-shirts and how one of them had asked if the ride went higher than the clouds. But when the Ferris wheel completed its slow rotation and the gondolas emptied, there was no sign of Nathan or Noah. Panic slithered into Ellen's chest like a cold hand. She'd scanned the surrounding area, her eyes darting from the exit gate to the neighboring snack stalls. She called their names at first, softly, then louder, each repetition slicing through the cheerful din. The crowd's smiles began to falter. Park security was summoned. The ride was stopped and checked. Every gondola was inspected, every bolt double-checked. There was no trace of the boys. No one had seen them disembark. No child had run off. They had simply vanished into thin air. Ellen fell to her knees by the base of the Ferris wheel, sobbing as a cluster of onlookers gathered, whispers beginning to curl through the summer air. Police arrived within the hour. The park was cordoned off, the Ferris wheel shut down, and the entire amusement park slowly drained of its laughter and color. The investigation was swift, aggressive, and fruitless. Security footage showed the boys entering the queue but failed to show them boarding. Multiple angles were missing, cameras glitched or had been poorly maintained. Witnesses were inconsistent. Some swore they saw the boys get into a gondola. Others believed they had turned away before boarding. One elderly man claimed he saw a park employee leading them away, but his description changed each time he was asked. The ride operator, a young man named Felix Jorel, insisted on his story until the day he too vanished. 3 days after the incident, his apartment was found empty. Rent unpaid, belongings untouched. Ellen, meanwhile, stopped eating. Her skin grew pale, her movements mechanical. Her husband Peter stayed silent most days, sitting on their porch with the boys' bicycles untouched beside him. As weeks turned into months, the community shifted from concern to resignation. The story faded from front pages. The park, after a brief closure, reopened under new management and rebranded the Ferris wheel. It was given a new coat of paint, a new name, and a refurbished lighting system. But for Ellen, nothing changed. Every year, on the anniversary of their disappearance, she returned to that same bench, staring at the spinning wheel. She would bring flowers, a pair of red shirts, and 2 small stuffed animals the twins once adored. Parkgoers whispered when they saw her. Some believed she had lost her mind. Others believed the story had always been exaggerated. But Ellen never wavered in her belief that her sons were still out there. Somewhere. Somehow. 15 years passed. Ellen aged in ways not entirely visible. Her once smooth voice developed a tremble. Her hands shook when she held a photo. She kept her son's room exactly as it had been the day they disappeared, every book in place, every toy untouched. Her husband had left 5 years after the incident, unable to endure the silent torment that filled their home. Ellen remained. She worked at the local library and refused to move, refused to change anything that might suggest she had given up. Most people had forgotten about the twins. New families moved into the neighborhood. Children played in the streets. But Ellen lived in a quiet time capsule, counting days that always led her back to that ride. On the 15th anniversary, Ellen returned to Westvale Park as she always did. But something felt different. The air was heavier, the colors more muted, the crowd thinner. She found her bench unoccupied. She sat placing the flowers on her lap, her eyes tracing the slow spin of the Ferris wheel. Her gaze was distant, unfocused, until it caught on something strange. At the base of the ride, near a patch of overgrown grass that hadn't been trimmed in years, something glinted. A flicker of metallic light. Curious, she rose, walking slowly, cautiously toward the anomaly. Her shoes crunched the gravel beneath her. The crowd behind her faded. She knelt down. It was a metal latch half buried under dirt and weeds. A latch attached to a square of old wood. Something not meant to be seen. She felt her heart begin to race. She looked around, but no one paid attention. Trembling, she brushed away the dirt, revealing the outline of what looked like a trapdoor. It was rusted old and appeared untouched for years. Her breath caught in her throat. She didn't dare open it then, not without help, not without knowing what it led to. She backed away, heart pounding. In that moment, everything changed. The story long thought to be over had just opened its first real chapter. And beneath that Ferris wheel in the shadows and rust, Ellen felt something stir. Not memory, not grief, but the unmistakable tremor of hidden truth. Ellen returned the next morning, just after sunrise. The park had not yet opened, and the air still held the cool dampness of early morning dew. She carried a flashlight and a crowbar in a canvas tote, her breath fogging in the chilly air. She moved quickly but cautiously through the silent grounds, past unmanned ticket booths and idle rides that seemed almost ghost-like without the crowds. The Ferris wheel towered above her like a metal skeleton against the pale dawn sky. Her heart thudded with a strange mix of dread and certainty. She knew what she had seen the day before had not been a trick of light or her imagination. She found the patch of overgrowth once again, dropped to her knees, and began clearing the area more thoroughly. The wood panel was real. The metal latch was cold under her fingers. She wedged the crowbar into the seam and pulled. With a groan of old hinges, the trapdoor opened. The scent that escaped was damp and stale. A gust of air rose from the darkness below, thick with earth and rust. Ellen hesitated, her flashlight trembling slightly in her hand. Then she aimed the beam into the opening. A narrow metal staircase descended into darkness, its steps rusted and slick. She gripped the crowbar in one hand and the flashlight in the other and began her descent. The air grew cooler as she moved downward. Each footstep echoed dully, swallowed by the silence below. At the bottom of the stairs, she found herself in a narrow corridor lined with concrete and dim light fixtures that had long since died. The walls bore flaking paint and graffiti etched in childish scribbles. She moved slowly, the flashlight beam sweeping across the floor. There were discarded food wrappers, a broken tricycle, a child's shoe. The corridor opened into a larger space, a chamber with old benches and faded murals on the walls. The paintings depicted smiling children holding balloons and ice cream cones, but the paint had peeled away in jagged scars, making the images grotesque. A half-broken sign hung crookedly from the ceiling. It read, "Joy Zone B3. Ellen's breath caught. The name meant nothing to her, but the way it was painted bright and playful contrasted harshly with the cold reality around her. She stepped carefully across the room, shining her light into corners. On the far wall was a door. Its frame was scorched at the edges, and a faint blackened handprint stained the center. She reached for the handle, paused, and pulled it open. Inside was a small room filled with cots. Children's drawings were taped to the walls. Crayon rainbows, smiling stick figures, and hearts scrawled with names. Most had faded. Ellen moved to the wall, her eyes scanning each drawing. One in particular made her knees go weak. Two boys side by side, drawn with bright yellow hair and matching red shirts. Above them, in clumsy handwriting, was the name Branson. Her hands trembled as she reached out to touch the paper. It crinkled beneath her fingers, fragile with age. She collapsed onto a nearby cot, staring at the drawing, her mind racing. This was real. This was proof. Her boys had been here, at least at some point. She felt hot tears fill her eyes, not from grief, but from the sudden rush of hope. She pulled herself up and continued exploring. Behind another door, she found lockers, some open and empty others sealed shut. In one, she discovered notebooks, childish scribbles inside detailing daily routines. Simple lines like cereal was cold again, or Miss June said, "No games today." A name appeared repeatedly, Miss June. Ellen had never heard that name during the investigation. She took photos with her phone. Every page, every corner of the room, every item. She needed others to see this. She needed someone to believe her now. The hallway continued deeper, curving into more darkness. The walls turned from concrete to aged paneling. She could hear the soft drip of water. Somewhere in the shadows, something moved. Ellen froze the flashlight beam quivering. She listened. Another sound followed a soft metallic scrape, then silence. Her pulse quickened. She slowly backed away, her shoes crunching over debris. Whatever was there did not follow. She reached the stairwell and climbed back up into the morning light, her legs shaking from the effort. Once outside, she pulled the trapdoor shut and covered it hastily. Her mind raced as she walked briskly through the now stirring park. She exited through a side gate, avoiding the few employees beginning to arrive. Back in her car, she sat gripping the steering wheel, trying to slow her breathing. Her phone buzzed with a low battery warning, but she had the photos. She had evidence. Her hands still smelled faintly of rust and mildew. That evening, Ellen reached out to Officer David Riles, one of the original detectives on the case. He had since retired but remained local. They met at a diner on the edge of town. She showed him the photos. At first, his expression was politely skeptical. Then his brow furrowed. He recognized the drawings. He had seen similar ones recovered from an old storage unit years ago, but they had been dismissed. Just scribbles with no link. He asked where she found them. She hesitated but decided to tell him. About the trapdoor, about the stairs, about the underground rooms. David sat in silence, then finally nodded. He agreed to help her dig deeper, but he warned her. Places like that did not just happen. Someone built them, someone funded them, and someone had worked very hard to keep them hidden. That night, Ellen lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her mind replayed the journey below the Ferris wheel. The drawings. The names. The smell. She thought of the twins' laughter, of their tiny hands in hers. 15 years. And yet beneath the rusted heart of Westvale Park, time had barely moved. The chamber had waited. Quietly, patiently. And now that it had been found, nothing would be the same again. The following morning, Ellen met Officer Riles outside the Municipal Records Building. He looked older than she remembered, with silver streaks in his beard and a slight stoop in his posture. Still, his handshake was firm and his eyes sharp. He had taken an interest again, perhaps from guilt or unfinished duty. Inside the dusty archives, they requested access to historical building permits and blueprints of Westvale Park. The clerk, a young man with acne scars and bored eyes, handed over a box without asking too many questions. Ellen and David carried the box to a nearby table, the metal legs squealing slightly as they sat down. Inside were dozens of rolled blueprints, stapled permits, and thick files tied with string. They began to sift through the paperwork, fingers flipping through yellowed pages. Many permits were routine, detailing minor repairs and seasonal updates, but one file stood out. It was thinner, stamped with a red seal and labeled Project Joy Expansion 1985. David opened it carefully, and inside they found a map that showed a substructure beneath the Ferris wheel marked Restricted Service Access. No explanation, no signatures. Just a series of narrow hallways and a central chamber labeled Observation Room. Ellen traced the lines on the map with her finger. The layout matched what she had seen underground. The cots, the murals, the hallway. But the map included additional corridors she had not explored. There was also a small room at the far end labeled Archive. Her breath caught. They had found confirmation that the space had been constructed intentionally. David flipped the page and found a list of approved contractors. One name was repeated several times. Halverson and Boyd Installations. Ellen did not recognize it. David nodded slowly and pulled out his phone. A few taps brought up an old article. Halverson and Boyd had gone bankrupt in the early 90s, but not before being investigated for unlicensed structural projects across the state. There were allegations of unsafe facilities and unsanctioned underground builds for amusement parks and experimental institutions. The charges had never led to prosecution. Most of the records had vanished with the company. Ellen felt a chill crawl up her spine. Whoever funded those rooms beneath the Ferris wheel had wanted them hidden. They spent the next hour scanning other employee-related documents. David focused on HR files the park had been required to submit for inspection in the 80s and 90s. One file caught his attention. It listed a child care coordinator named June Mathis. She had worked at Westvale Park for only 2 summers. Her job title was vague, and her termination was never formally recorded. Ellen remembered the name from the children's notebook she had found underground. David searched public records and found a driver's license record linked to an address only a few towns over. Without hesitation, they left the archive and drove south. The town was called Delmont. It was smaller than Westvale, more rural, its streets lined with maple trees and quiet porches. The house was a modest ranch style with cracked pavement and a faded yellow mailbox. David knocked while Ellen stayed by the car, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. An elderly woman answered the door. Her frame was thin, almost brittle, and her gray hair was pulled into a tight bun. David introduced himself, careful to phrase his questions gently. At the mention of Westvale Park, the woman tensed. She confirmed she had worked there many years ago. When he asked about the underground rooms, her expression changed. She looked past David to Ellen, their eyes locking across the yard. The woman's voice wavered as she invited them inside. The living room smelled of stale tea and mothballs. Framed photos of a younger June adorned the walls. She sat carefully on the couch as if bracing for a long-forgotten storm. Her confession came slowly. Yes, the rooms were real. Yes, they had been used during a period when the park was experimenting with a new program. She had been told it was a temporary childcare initiative, a way to entertain children, while parents rode certain attractions. But the children were not always picked up right away. Some stayed overnight. Others were never claimed at all. June hesitated, her fingers trembling as she reached for a small wooden box on the side table. Inside were photographs, faded Polaroids, children smiling awkwardly, many in matching red shirts. Ellen took the box with shaking hands. She flipped through the images. Some of the faces she did not recognize. But near the bottom, there was a photo that made her gasp. 2 boys standing side by side with bright blonde hair and mismatched sneakers, Nathan and Noah. The photo was dated July 9th, 15 years ago, the day they vanished. June looked away, her eyes glistening. She had kept the photo, she explained, because the boys had seemed different, more aware, more scared. They had asked questions, asked where their mother was. She had not seen them after that week. She had tried to ask her supervisor, but no answers came. Then, one day, her contract was terminated and she was told never to return. David asked about the observation room. June admitted she had only seen it once. It was behind a locked steel door guarded by a man in a brown uniform. Inside were monitors and sound equipment. Cameras were hidden in the child areas. She did not know who reviewed the footage, only that it was always running. Ellen felt sick. Her boys had been watched, tracked, possibly studied. She thanked June, promising to return with more questions later. As they left, June pressed the wooden box into Ellen's hands. "Keep it," she said. "Someone needs to remember them." On the drive home, Ellen sat in silence, clutching the box against her chest like a lifeline. Her thoughts raced with terrible clarity. Someone had used those rooms. Someone had taken children and built a system to erase them. And someone was still out there. David contacted a former colleague who now worked with a federal investigative unit. He explained the situation, carefully omitting no details. The evidence from the blueprints, the witness testimony, and especially the photograph of the boys provided a compelling reason to act. Within days, a small team was dispatched under the radar to Westvale Park. They wore plain clothes and carried concealed recording devices. Ellen joined them, her presence now central to the investigation. The park's current management claimed ignorance. They had purchased the property 10 years after the twins vanished and had no records of underground structures. Permission was granted to inspect the Ferris Wheel's foundation. Work began early in the morning. By noon, the trapdoor was uncovered again. This time it was documented, photographed, and marked with evidence tags. The team descended slowly, careful not to damage the passage. Ellen followed closely behind her, heart pounding with a dread she could not yet name. The corridors were as she had remembered them, damp, silent, still charged with something unspeakable. One of the agents found another door previously hidden behind a false wall. It led to a staircase that descended even deeper. The lower chamber was colder and darker than the first. The air felt different, more stale, more intentional. This room was lined with metal shelving and cabinets. Each drawer was labeled with dates and codes. The agents opened several. Inside were VHS tapes, some cracked with age, others still in good condition. A dusty logbook sat atop one cabinet, its cover marked Inventory Session D. Ellen watched as gloved hands flipped through the pages. Names were listed, names of children. Dates matched the photograph from June's house. There were codes next to each name. Some were underlined in red. Others had been scribbled over with dark ink. One entry read Branson Twins. Code 83K. No pickup. Session terminated. The agent looked at Ellen, his face pale. They were here, he said. She already knew. She did not need the codes to tell her that. She could feel it in the walls, in the silence, in the way her son's names looked so sterile on that yellowing page. They continued exploring the chamber. Behind one of the shelves was a narrow tunnel recently reinforced with concrete. The team followed it, stepping over collapsed crates and old wiring. At the end was another door. It was heavier than the others, reinforced, locked from the outside. The agent used a small drill to disengage the latch. The door creaked open, revealing a small windowless room. Inside was a desk, an old camera mounted to the wall, and a chair with leather straps on the arms. Ellen recoiled, covering her mouth. On the walls were faded photos, newspaper clippings, and what appeared to be psychological profiles. Most of the documents were in code. One agent carefully pulled them down, placing each into evidence bags. A monitor sat on the desk, its screen cracked but still connected to a power source. When plugged into a battery pack, it flickered to life. Grainy footage appeared. A series of clips showed children in the previous chambers, eating, playing, sitting silently, watching. The timestamp on the screen stopped on July 12th. The last date anyone had seen Nathan and Noah. Ellen turned away. She could not watch anymore. The realization that her sons had been part of something so methodical made her stomach turn. David placed a hand on her shoulder, guiding her back towards the main corridor. The agents continued cataloging the scene. Hours passed. The sun had long set by the time they emerged. That evening, Ellen sat alone in her living room, the box of photographs still beside her. Her phone vibrated. It was David. He spoke slowly. They had identified several other children from the footage. Some matched missing persons cases from the late 80s and early 90s. Others were still unaccounted for. A federal task force would be assembled. But there was something else. David had traced the code 83K to an old employee tracking system used by Halverson and Boyd. It referenced assigned observers, people stationed underground. One name repeated across several documents: L. Gorman. Ellen did not recognize it. David promised to investigate further, but the name stirred something in her. A memory. She pulled an old park map from her attic. In the margin, someone had written a phone number. The handwriting was not hers. It had been Noah's. She remembered him scribbling it the week before they vanished. The number still worked. A voicemail answered in a monotone voice. Leave a message after the tone. Ellen hesitated, then spoke clearly. I am the mother of Nathan and Noah Branson. I need to speak with you. I found the tunnels. I found everything. She ended the call. Her fingers trembled. For the first time in 15 years, she had hope. Not the kind rooted in denial, but the kind built on something solid, tangible, real. Her sons had been there. She was no longer alone in knowing that. Now others knew too. Authorities, agents, a name had surfaced. And perhaps, just perhaps, a path forward. A week later, Ellen was summoned to a secure location set up by the task force. It was a converted office in a government building 3 towns over. The windows were sealed, the halls quiet, and the rooms dimly lit with heavy blinds drawn shut. Ellen entered through a side door where David waited for her. His expression was unreadable, a mix of fatigue and something deeper. He led her to a small room with a monitor, a speaker, and a recording device. One of the agents handed her a set of headphones and told her they had recovered a single surviving audio reel from the equipment Leonard had stored in his cellar. The tape had been digitally restored as much as possible. What she was about to hear had been recorded inside the chamber labeled Observation Room. Ellen braced herself, placing the headphones over her ears. The agent pressed play. The recording began with static. Then the faint hum of ventilation could be heard. A man's voice emerged, clipped and professional, dictating notes about compliance levels and adjusted dosages. And then came the sound of a door creaking open. Footsteps. A softer voice spoke next. It was a child, tentative and confused. The boy asked if he could go home now. There was a pause. Then the man replied that progress had not yet reached the required threshold. The boy said his name. Ellen froze. It was Noah. His voice was higher than she remembered, but the cadence was unmistakable. She could hear him asking about his brother. The man said Nathan had been relocated to a different wing. The recording ended with the sound of a chair scraping and the faint closing of a door. Ellen removed the headphones slowly, her hands trembling. She looked at David, who nodded solemnly. He confirmed the voice had been run through voice recognition software and matched archived home videos of Noah with near certainty. The date on the tape aligned with the logbook entry Leonard had found. This meant both boys had been alive for at least 10 days after their disappearance. It also confirmed that they had been separated. Ellen struggled to process it. Her children had been kept apart, observed, manipulated. She asked if there were any other tapes. The agent explained that most of the analog footage had degraded beyond recovery, but the team is analyzing digital traces in the park's old network servers. It would take time, but they were hopeful. Later that evening, David drove Ellen back to her home. The car ride was quiet. Rain had begun to fall, casting long streaks across the windshield. Ellen sat motionless, staring at the blurred trees passing by. When they reached her driveway, she did not get out immediately. She turned to David and asked about the name F.J. Harding. He said the task force had begun to trace transactions and phone records linked to Harding. One number had pinged near the state border only 2 months ago. It had connected briefly to a relay tower near an abandoned industrial park. David promised they would follow up on every lead. Ellen nodded and stepped out into the rain. The sky opened above her, but she did not flinch. She walked to the porch, entered her home, and sat on the floor of her son's bedroom. The next morning, Ellen received a package in the mail. There was no return address. Inside was a single flash drive and a note that said simply, "Watch this." She plugged it into her laptop and opened the file. It was a grainy video of a boy, maybe 12 or 13, sitting at a desk in a windowless room. His hair was longer, his frame thinner, but Ellen knew immediately. It was Nathan. He looked directly into the camera and spoke with a calmness that startled her. He said his name, his age, and the year. He said if anyone was watching, it meant he had gotten out. He warned that the people who built the rooms were not gone. He said they had plans for other locations. Then he looked down, seemed to hesitate, and said one final thing. He said, "Tell Mom I remember the beach trip and the song she used to hum when we fell asleep." Ellen covered her mouth and wept. Her son had survived long enough to make a message. He had remembered her. He had fought to leave a trace. She called David immediately. He came within the hour and took the drive into custody. The metadata on the file showed it had been uploaded 2 weeks ago, which meant Nathan had either survived or someone close to him had preserved the video and waited for the right time to send it. The agent analyzed the data and found an embedded GPS tag from the first few frames. It placed the video's upload point just 50 miles from Westvale. David requested immediate authorization to send a team to the coordinates. Ellen insisted on going with them. By evening, a team of 4 agents, David and Ellen, were driving through back roads, leading to a cluster of abandoned farm buildings. The GPS led them to a weathered barn with a caved-in roof and boarded windows. The team spread out and approached slowly. Inside the barn was a hatch beneath a loose section of floorboards. The team forced it open, revealing a steel staircase similar to the one under the Ferris Wheel. They descended carefully, flashlights illuminating a narrow corridor. The air was stale, but not untouched. They found a series of small rooms, empty cots, cracked screens, food wrappers no older than a few weeks. At the far end was a room with a desk and a shattered camera mount. On the wall was a message scratched into the plaster. It read, "Keep going. Do not stop. For them." The words burned into Ellen's heart. Nathan had been there. He had left the message. He wanted her to keep searching. She stood in the center of the room, breathing deeply, letting the silence wrap around her. Her son was not a memory. He was out there. The task force set up a temporary operations center near the barn. They swept the site with specialized equipment, uncovering partial footprints, food packaging, and several personal items, including a torn notebook page with symbols that matched those found in the Joy Initiative files. Ellen remained on site, her presence no longer that of a grieving mother, but of an unofficial investigator who had earned her place among the team. One agent showed her the note they recovered. The symbols were arranged in a sequence that mirrored the layout of tunnels beneath Westvale Park. It was a code, a path. David believed Nathan had used the same system the initiative had taught him. Whatever conditioning the boys had been subjected to, it had given Nathan the tools to survive and resist. Ellen studied the page and recognized a specific shape in the sequence. It matched a figure her sons used to draw in their coloring books. It resembled a tree with roots stretching downward. She remembered once asking what it meant. Nathan had said it was where secrets live. Now she understood. He had left a clue only she would recognize. Satellite imaging showed a similar pattern etched into the terrain of a nearby region known for its dense forests and abandoned mining sites. The symbol was faint, but visible, carved into a clearing no more than 10 miles away. The agents traced the coordinates and confirmed recent ground disturbance. They prepared to investigate at dawn. Ellen insisted on joining them, arguing that her familiarity with Nathan's thinking could guide them. At first they resisted, but David supported her, reminding them how far she had brought the case. As the sun began to rise, the team hiked through thick underbrush, following trails barely wide enough for one person. Birds stirred in the treetops and the wind moved the branches with gentle urgency. When they reached the clearing, they found what they had expected. A ring of stones, symbols scratched into bark, a narrow path descending toward a hidden ravine. They entered the ravine carefully, the walls narrowing until they reached what looked like the mouth of a collapsed tunnel. Debris blocked most of the entrance, but a small gap had been cleared on one side, just wide enough for a person to slip through. Ellen went first, crawling carefully. On the other side was a small chamber, dry and cold, with remnants of a fire pit and a tattered blanket. This had been a hiding place. Someone had stayed here, possibly for days. On the wall was another message carved in crude lines. One word: close. Ellen whispered it aloud, her voice echoing off the stone. The agents followed and confirmed the signs of recent activity. Heat traces remained on the stone near the fire. A tin can still held the smell of beans. Nathan had been here recently, maybe hours ago. As the team regrouped, one agent discovered a series of small mirrors hidden in the rock crevices. They had been placed strategically to reflect light from the entrance into deeper tunnels. It was a signal system. Ellen smiled through her tears. Nathan had always played with mirrors as a boy. He had called them his light letters. This was no accident. He wanted them to find him, but he also wanted them to avoid danger. The deeper the team ventured, the clearer it became that someone had followed this trail ahead of them. Another person, Possibly an ally or possibly someone trying to erase Nathan's trail. Footprints became visible in the mud, adult-sized and heavy. They led to a split in the tunnel, two paths, one clean, the other cluttered with broken boards and debris. The footprints went toward the cleaner path. Ellen pointed to the cluttered one. She said Nathan would never take the obvious route. They moved through the broken corridor, stepping over fallen beams and cracked stone. At the end was a steel door, rusted but unlocked. Inside was a room with a broken table, cracked tiles, and a single mattress. On the mattress lay a worn backpack. Ellen recognized it immediately. It was Nathan's. A tiny patch on the side read, "Space Cadet." She opened it with trembling hands. Inside were water bottles, protein bars, a flashlight, and a weathered notebook. The first page said, "Do not go above. They are watching." She flipped through more pages. They were filled with maps, sketches, notes on safe spots, and symbols matching those on previous documents. But one page had a name written over and over again. Noah. Ellen's heart caught in her chest. Nathan had been searching too. He was not just hiding. He was looking for his brother. David reviewed the notebook and confirmed its contents aligned with their intelligence. But it also suggested that Nathan believed Noah was alive, possibly being held somewhere else. The paths had split long ago, and now the search would have to do the same. The team began organizing two efforts. One would continue following Nathan's route, hoping to intercept him. The other would investigate known locations linked to the Joy Initiative's secondary facilities. Ellen faced a choice. She could not be in two places at once. David told her she needed to decide where her heart led her. She held the notebook tightly, flipping once more to the last page. It read, "If someone finds this and they know about her, tell her I did not forget. Tell her I kept the song." She closed her eyes. She could almost hear the lullaby she used to hum. Ellen chose the path that followed Nathan's trail. Her decision was not made easily, but the evidence of his recent presence gave her hope that he might still be within reach. The task force respected her choice and divided accordingly. David remained by her side along with two experienced agents. The second team, meanwhile, began investigating leads tied to a rumored holding site connected to the Joy Initiative, an abandoned juvenile facility west of the state line. Communication was kept constant between the two teams. Ellen's group returned to the steel door chamber to study the notebook further. Each map sketched by Nathan had arrows, warning signs, and numbers that the agents believed marked a sequence of exits and safe zones. One pattern repeated more than others, a spiral shape with a small cross in the center. Nathan had labeled it only once in the margin. Final door. It was drawn near coordinates that placed it close to a dried lake bed known locally as Hollow Ridge. They moved toward Hollow Ridge through backroads and wooded trails. The journey took nearly an entire day. The area had once been a mining zone, later converted into a campground and finally abandoned due to unstable ground. As they approached, Ellen noticed the earth underfoot became softer, almost sponge-like. The trees were thinner here, the sky more visible, and the wind carried a strange quiet. At the far edge of the lake bed, they found an old storage shack tilted on a sunken foundation. Inside, the floor had been disturbed. Boards were misaligned, and beneath them was yet another hatch. This one had been recently opened and resealed. It took all three agents to lift it. The space below led to a sloped tunnel partially collapsed but passable. They entered one at a time, Ellen following last. Her flashlight beam caught the glint of something metallic on the wall. It was another mirror angled downward. The tunnel led to a chamber that looked more clinical than the others. White tiles lined the walls, and the floor was clean but damp. A hallway split off in both directions. One side had broken lights, the other flickered intermittently. The flickering light illuminated a door with the number 41 scratched into it. Ellen approached cautiously. She reached out and pushed. The door creaked open to reveal a small room, sparse and empty, except for a single photograph taped to the wall. It was of Ellen and her sons taken years ago at a beach trip. She remembered that day. The photo had never been published. It had only ever existed in a private album. She stepped back, her chest tightening. Someone had been watching her long before the disappearance. This was not random. This was chosen. David signaled the others. They secured the area and began mapping the tunnel system. A storage room nearby held old uniforms, faded ID badges, and stacks of VHS tapes labeled by date. The most recent one was marked with only a symbol. It matched the spiral and cross Nathan had drawn. The team took the tape back to a temporary base and played it using an old deck brought for such discoveries. The video began with a static image of an empty room. After several seconds, a boy entered the frame. Taller now, but thin. His hair darker and eyes tired. Nathan sat on the edge of a cot and stared directly into the lens. He held something in his hands, something wrapped in cloth. He slowly unraveled it. It was a music box. He opened it, and a familiar lullaby began to play. Ellen's hands flew to her mouth. It was her song. Nathan spoke. He said if anyone was watching this, then he had failed to wait long enough. He said he had tried to leave messages and hoped they were being followed. He warned that not all the exits were safe, and that one of the corridors was still in use by someone from the original program. He named a location. Then he said he believed Noah had been transferred. He had found a list, only first names, but Noah was on it. Beside his name were numbers, 257. The tape ended there. Ellen sat in silence, her eyes locked on the frozen image of her son. David repeated the number, 257. He believed it could be a code, possibly a room number, a file reference, or even a date. The agents cross-referenced it with known addresses and records. One connection stood out. A private transport hub used by the original contractors located at mile marker 257 on a remote highway. The team moved out at dawn. The location was difficult to reach, nestled behind overgrown fencing and barricaded by fallen trees. They cleared a path with hand tools and flashlights. Behind the gates was a warehouse, partially collapsed but still intact in sections. In one corner, a steel door marked with the number 257 led into a reinforced hallway. The walls were lined with old electronic panels and a series of red emergency lights. As they moved deeper, Ellen noticed the temperature dropped significantly. Ahead, a door stood ajar. Inside was a room lined with glass. Observation pods. Each one held remnants of personal items. A toy, a shoe, a sketch. Most were empty, long abandoned. But one pod had markings. Scratches on the inside of the glass. Letters. They spelled Nathan. The pod was open, unoccupied. A symbol was scratched next to the name. The spiral and cross. The pod scratched with Nathan's name left no doubt. He had been there recently. The presence of his symbol beside it was more than a message. It was a trail marker, a sign to continue forward. Ellen moved through the room slowly, her eyes scanning each surface for anything more. The glass pods were thick-sealed long ago, but some showed evidence of tampering. A few were shattered. Others had been opened cleanly. Personal items remained inside, items clearly meant to provide comfort. A child's blanket, a hairbrush, a small plastic dinosaur. David instructed one agent to photograph everything. Another began scanning the facility for heat signatures or recent movements. The building groaned as if alive. Pipes hissed in the ceiling. Somewhere water dripped steadily. The team advanced through a corridor branching from the pod room. It led to a circular space lined with filing cabinets and computer stations powered by backup batteries. The monitors were dark, but the data drives remained. Dust coated the surface, but fingerprints broke the layer. Someone had accessed the files recently. David powered one of the drives using a portable unit. The screen flickered and displayed a login prompt already bypassed. A list appeared. Dozens of names, dates, and code designations. Each child had a record, some marked incomplete, others marked terminated. Ellen scanned the list quickly. Her eyes stopped on one entry, Noah Branson, status unknown, session reassigned. Last location update, Facility N. That was the first time a location had been mentioned. Facility N was not on any official maps. She pointed to the entry, and the agents began downloading the files to their secured device. Another file listed internal reports under the initials FJH. David read one aloud. It detailed psychological evaluations of isolated siblings, noting the increase in compliance when emotional bonds were manipulated. The date matched the week after the boys had vanished. Ellen turned away. She could not bear to read more. Further back in the room was a metal cabinet labeled Archives. Inside were stacks of video reels and audio tapes, all coded by number. Some were marked in red ink. One tape had a sticker labeled BR83. The initials matched the twins' surnames and their assigned code from earlier files. The agents played the reel using a field viewer. The footage was grainy, but clear enough. It showed Noah sitting alone drawing with crayons. A voice from off-camera asked him what he missed most. He said, "I miss my brother." The voice asked what he would say to him if he came back. Noah answered softly, "I would tell him I am not angry, tell him I waited." The recording ended abruptly. Ellen sat back in her chair, her breath shallow. This was not just proof, this was a message frozen in time. The kind only a brother would understand. The team found a locked door behind the archive shelves. It led to a room with a reinforced glass and a wall of monitors, many now cracked or dead. One still glowed faintly. Static danced across it until a shape moved into view. A figure passed through a hallway on a feed labeled Sub-N. The timestamp showed it was from less than an hour ago. David and the agents froze. Someone was still in the complex. Ellen leaned closer. The figure paused near a corner and looked directly at the camera. The image was blurry, but she recognized the posture, the shape of the face. It was Nathan. He was here, still moving, still trying to stay ahead. David gave quiet orders. The team split following the building's layout to intercept the hallway marked on the monitor. Ellen stayed behind monitoring the screen. She watched as Nathan turned and vanished down another corridor. The agents moved quickly through the building, mapping their path by memory and Nathan's notebook. The hallways were damp, narrow, and twisted. Flashlights bounced off exposed pipes and peeled paint. At each junction, they paused and listened. One agent spotted movement ahead and signaled. They advanced slowly, their steps deliberate. The corridor narrowed into a stairwell descending to the basement. They found muddy footprints still fresh. Nathan had passed through minutes earlier. The stairwell opened into a tunnel with a metal gate left ajar. On the other side was a chamber filled with beds, toys, and clothing. Some items were old, others newer. This was not just a memory. This was still in use. And someone had been here recently. Ellen arrived moments later, having followed a side path. She stepped into the room and saw it. On the wall, written in chalk, was a message. "I saw the door. I did not open it." He said not yet. Ellen turned slowly. She whispered her son's name aloud. A sound echoed through the chamber. A creak, a breath, then a figure stepped from the shadows. He was older now, taller, lean, his eyes wide with disbelief. It was Nathan. His clothes were torn and his hair hung in strands, but his eyes, they had not changed. He looked at Ellen for a long moment. Neither spoke. Then he stepped forward. She moved to him. They embraced in silence, wrapped in a moment suspended in time. David and the agents stood back, giving them space. Nathan whispered something into her ear. Ellen's eyes widened. She nodded. Then she turned to David and said 3 words. He found Noah. Nathan led them through the lower levels of the facility with steady urgency. His steps were cautious but confident, moving through shadowed corridors as if he had memorized every twist and turn. Ellen stayed close behind him, her heart pounding with every corner they passed. David and the agents followed their weapons ready, though Nathan assured them there would be no guards. The place had been abandoned in stages. He whispered that some doors were sealed not by locks but by warnings. Warnings he had learned to obey. They moved past rusted doors and empty rooms until they reached a narrow passage choked with vines. The air here felt colder. Nathan stopped and turned. He pointed to a heavy steel door covered in dust. On its surface was a faded symbol drawn in chalk. the spiral, and the cross. He said Noah was inside. He said it was time. David approached the door and tried the handle. It did not budge. The agents worked together to break the seal. The sound echoed through the corridor like a sigh released after years of silence. As the door creaked open, a warm light spilled out from within. Ellen stepped inside first. The room beyond was unlike anything she had seen. It was clean and quiet, filled with books, soft furniture, and toys arranged neatly. In the center sat a boy, his back to them, working at a table with colored pencils. He turned slowly as they entered. His eyes met Ellen's. The room fell into stillness. It was Noah. He stood without fear. His body was thin, but he looked healthy. His hair had grown long, and his face bore the softness of someone who had lived in isolation too long. He studied Ellen's face for a moment, then smiled. A quiet knowing passed between them. Nathan stepped forward, and his twin stared at him for a long, breathless second before moving into his arms. They embraced silently. Years of separation crumbled in an instant. The agents remained at the doorway, overwhelmed by the surreal stillness of the moment. Ellen stepped closer, her voice trembling. She asked Noah if he knew who she was. He nodded slowly. Then he said he remembered the beach trip. He remembered the song. And he remembered her. David moved to examine the room. It had power-filtered air and a functioning bathroom. The cameras on the walls were disconnected. On the far shelf sat a stack of notebooks. David opened one and found pages filled with notes and drawings. Noah had documented everything, each day, each test, each change in routine. The last pages were filled with questions. Why did they stop coming? Why was I left alone? Where's my brother? Ellen took the book and pressed it to her chest. The pain of what her sons had endured cut deep, but here they were, alive, together. That had to mean something. The agents confirmed the space was safe. They escorted the group back through the tunnels with Noah and Nathan walking side by side. The air felt different on the way out. Lighter, as if the weight of silence had finally lifted. When they emerged from the tunnel into the gray afternoon light, Ellen saw birds flying overhead and felt the breeze on her skin like a memory returned. She reached for each of her sons' hands and held them tightly. Neither pulled away. The task force arranged transport and medical support. Both boys were taken to a secure facility for immediate care. Doctors reported mild malnourishment, but no lasting physical harm. The psychological scars would take longer to understand, but they were safe. They were free. In the weeks that followed, arrests were made. The name F.J. Harding was linked to a former intelligence contractor operating under a shell identity. His whereabouts remained unknown, but several accomplices were located and brought into custody. The investigation spread nationally. Other sites were discovered, many already dismantled, others left to decay. Survivors came forward inspired by the Branson story. Stories long buried began to surface. The Joy Initiative was revealed to be a decades-long covert program operating beneath layers of corporate and institutional silence. The public reaction was swift. Demands for justice, new laws, a reckoning. Ellen chose not to speak publicly. She stayed focused on her sons, guiding them through recovery, rebuilding trust, and relearning life outside the shadows. Nathan adjusted more quickly. He had learned to survive by imagining the outside world. He carried guilt, but also resilience. Noah took longer. His time alone had taught him stillness, but also confusion. He often woke in silence, unsure of whether he had truly left. But together they found balance. They attended therapy. They visited the ocean. They listened to the lullaby Ellen used to hum until the notes no longer made them cry. One afternoon, 6 months after the rescue, Ellen returned to Westvale Park with her sons. The gates were closed, the rides rusted and silent. They stood before the Ferris Wheel where it all began. Nathan looked up and said he remembered the colors. He remembered the sound of laughter just before everything changed. Noah took his hand and said he remembered the light coming through the slats beneath the wheel. Ellen stood between them and whispered that they were not just what happened to them, they were more. They were who they had become. They placed a small plaque at the base of the ride. It read, in memory of the missing and the found, in hope for the unheard, in strength of those who came home. They did not speak afterward. They simply stood together, the wind lifting through the trees. Ellen closed her eyes and thought of that day 15 years ago, the smell of popcorn, the sound of children's laughter, and the moment her boys vanished without a trace. The day had haunted her. But this day, this moment, it had rewritten the ending. In the quiet that followed, she understood something new. Survival was not only about being rescued. It was about choosing to heal, choosing to carry forward without forgetting. Her sons had taught her that. Through their drawings, their messages, their courage in the face of abandonment. They had built a path out of the dark, and she had followed them not as a savior, but as a mother who never stopped listening. In that way, the story was not just about what had been lost, it was about what had endured. If you enjoyed this story and want more mysteries like it, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. We post new stories regularly that dive into the strange and the unforgettable. Let us know in the comments what you think about this plot and where you're watching from. We read every message.